Welcome to Dark Chronicles. Today, you're about to hear a horror story that will send shivers down your spine. There's a legend, known by only a few, about a ghost train in Stoll, Kansas, a town famous for its grim stories and unsolved mysteries. This train, the old ones say, appears when someone curious seeks it, offering a chance for answers. But at what cost? What you're about to hear is a terrifying journey and a warning. Be very careful with what you search for. If you dare, keep watching. Otherwise, it might be best to stop now. I've always been fascinated by urban legends. Perhaps it was my journalist instinct or my inability to ignore a good mystery, but when my editor suggested I write about one of these stories for this month's special column, I knew exactly which one to choose: the Phantom Train of Stoll. Stoll was a forgotten little town in Kansas, known for two things: its cemetery, allegedly one of the gates to hell, and the abandoned tracks that cut through the area like scars in the ground. Since I was a child, I had heard stories about the train that appeared on foggy nights, its whistle echoing like a distant wail. They said it carried the souls of the damned, disappearing forever along with any living soul unlucky enough to cross its path. My research started simple. I talked to some locals, most of whom were reluctant to discuss the subject. An old woman named Martha was the first to share something substantial. Sitting on her porch, her fingers clutching a faded shawl, she spoke of the night she heard the train. I was at the cemetery, visiting my husband's grave. The sun had already set, and a heavy fog began to blanket everything. That's when I heard it, a whistle so sorrowful that my heart nearly stopped. I knew I shouldn't look, but I couldn't help myself. I saw lights dancing through the trees, as if the train was there. But there were no tracks near the cemetery. She stopped, trembling. "Stay away from the tracks, boy. That train is not of this world." Her words sent chills down my spine, but they also fueled my determination to keep going. The next day, I went to the abandoned tracks. They snaked through the landscape like a dark line, surrounded by gnarled trees and overgrown weeds. I walked for hours until I found something that made me stop. Well, marks. They were fresh, as if a heavy train had passed through recently, but everyone knew those tracks hadn't been used in decades. I followed the marks until I came across an old sign, tilted and almost consumed by moss. Stoll Station, it read in faded letters. The air around me felt colder there, and a metallic smell lingered, as if something old and forgotten was trying to surface. As I examined the sign, a farmer suddenly appeared, emerging from a nearby trail. He looked wary and clearly uncomfortable with my presence. "You shouldn't be here," he said, shaking his head. "This place isn't safe, especially if you believe those stories." When I asked what he meant, he simply muttered something unsettling. "The train only takes the curious. Don't be the next one." Then, without waiting for my response, he turned and disappeared down the trail. His warning stayed in my mind, but my curiosity had already been piqued. I decided I had to witness the train for myself. I bought a tent and some supplies and returned to the tracks that very night. A thick fog began to form as I set up camp, and the silence around me felt almost supernatural. Around midnight, while jotting down my thoughts in a notebook, I heard something that froze the blood in my veins: the distant sound of a whistle. It was low and mournful, like the cry of a lost soul. I dropped my pen and rushed out of the tent, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound of wheels screeching against the tracks echoed through the darkness, growing closer and closer. There was no sign of lights or a locomotive, but the noise was unmistakable. I felt the ground vibrate faintly beneath my feet, and a cold wind swept through the forest, making the trees around me whisper as if they were alive. I was torn between the excitement of finally encountering something tangible and the paralyzing fear of being about to witness something I shouldn't. And then, suddenly, the sound vanished, leaving me alone in the silent night. Despite the terror gripping me, I decided I couldn't give up now. Tomorrow, I would follow the tracks deeper into the forest. Something, or someone, was out there, and I was determined to uncover what it was, even if it meant facing the phantom train of Stull itself. The next morning, I woke up feeling like something had changed around me. The fog from the previous night still hung between the trees, dense and heavy, almost alive. My body was tense, and my mind replayed the sound of the train whistle. I decided there was no time to waste. I needed to follow the tracks further. As I packed up my tent, I noticed the air was colder than the day before. Every step I took along the tracks made an unusual sound, as if the echo wasn't just bouncing off the trees, but coming back from somewhere much deeper. The silence of the surrounding forest was nearly oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a dry branch. After walking for about an hour, I spotted something unusual: a pocket watch hanging from a low branch, swinging gently in the breeze. I carefully grabbed it, noticing it was frozen at 3:33. The back of the watch had an engraving, "To those who depart, never to return." A chill ran down my spine, but I pocketed the object, sensing it might be a key piece of the puzzle. I continued walking, and the scenery around me began to change. The trees, once dense and green, grew sparser, their branches gnarled and leaves dry. The tracks, which already looked ancient and worn, were now covered in rust and moss, as though forgotten for centuries. But the strangest thing was that, from time to time, I came across fresh wheel marks and footprints along the rails. My mind began asking questions I didn't want to answer. Who else would be walking here? Could it be possible I wasn't alone in this investigation? Or worse, were the stories about the spirits true? Suddenly, I heard a low, muffled sound ahead of me, like footsteps mixed with the scrape of metal. I turned off my flashlight and froze, trying to listen more carefully. The noise grew louder, closer, and a figure began to emerge in the mist. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. He was dressed in old-fashioned railway worker clothes, like something out of an early 20th century film. A long, dark coat covered his body, and he wore a low hat that partially hid his face. But the most disturbing part was the way he moved. Not like someone walking, but as if being pushed or pulled by an invisible force. "You shouldn't be here," he said without even looking at me. His voice was hoarse, filled with something I could only describe as despair. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed down the tracks ahead of me and murmured, "The train will come for you. It always does." Before I could respond or try to follow him, he vanished into the mist as if he'd never been there. I stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Everything inside me screamed to turn back and leave, but something stronger, perhaps my stubbornness or my need to uncover the truth, forced me to keep going. The tracks began to slope downward, as if descending into a deep valley. The trees became even sparser, and in the distance, I could see a clearing. As I approached, I realized it was an old train station. The station looked like something out of a nightmare. The roof was partially caved in, and the walls were covered in moss and soot. There were broken benches and rusted lanterns hanging, some still swaying slightly, though there was no wind. But what truly caught my attention was the sign above the entrance. Its letters almost completely faded. Stull Station. The cold sensation intensified, and my breath started to cloud the air. On the ground, wheel marks grew more pronounced, as if a train had recently passed through. Yet there were no tracks connecting the station to the rest of the line. With my flashlight in hand, I stepped inside the station. The air was dense and smelled of iron and dampness. Every step I took made the floorboards creak, echoing through the empty space. On the walls hung old photographs of people who, on closer inspection, seemed familiar. My heart raced when I realized one of the faces belonged to the man I'd just seen in the mist minutes earlier. Then I heard it again. The whistle of the train, louder and closer than ever before. That sound, the train's whistle, cut through the silence of the night like a blade. It was more intense now, not just a distant sound, but something that seemed to echo directly in my mind. My heart raced, and every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave. But my curiosity, my stubbornness, or perhaps something beyond my control, kept me trapped in that place. The station seemed even more oppressive now, as if it were watching me. The shadows of the rusted lanterns danced on the walls, creating shapes that looked human, but distorted. I took a deep breath and forced myself to take a few more steps, following the sound that was growing louder. As I turned a corner, I came across something that made my stomach churn. On the ground, there was a pile of personal belongings. Old suitcases, hats, books, and even watches, all scattered in chaotic disarray. Many were covered in a layer of dust so thick that they seemed to have been there for decades. But some items were clean, as if they had been left there recently. I slowly approached, and something caught my eye. A wallet partially buried among the objects. I carefully picked it up, wiping the dirt off the plastic. My blood ran cold when I read the name. Michael Edwards. It was the name of a journalist who had gone missing while investigating the Stoll Ghost train story. He had also been seeking the truth and was never seen again. I put the wallet back on the ground, my body trembling with anxiety. Now, more than ever, I knew something was terribly wrong here. Before I could think of leaving, the sound of wheels on the tracks echoed through the station, followed by the metallic screech of brakes. There was no denying it. The train was here. I walked back to the main hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. Then I saw it. The train. It wasn't what I had imagined. It wasn't just an old, abandoned train. It was an entity in itself. The black metal of its carriages seemed to glow with a light of its own, like freshly forged coal. The windows were covered with soot, but I could swear I saw shadows moving inside, like people or something similar. The air around me grew even colder, and my breath began to cloud the air. The door of one of the carriages opened with a deafening sound, and a strong wind swept through the place, nearly knocking me over. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my feet began moving on their own. When I reached the open door, I heard a voice, low, almost a whisper, but clearly audible. "Come in. It's time to leave." My mind screamed to run, to escape this nightmare, but my body seemed frozen, as if something invisible was holding me there. It was then that I realized the train wasn't just a legend, it was a trap. It called to people, lured them with its promise of mystery, and then took them for itself. I looked inside the carriage, and what I saw nearly made me pass out. The seats were occupied by motionless figures, pale, with expressions frozen in terror or resignation. Among them, I recognized some of the faces from the photographs in the station. They were the missing, now eternal passengers of that train. The voice came again, louder this time. "Come in, or destiny will come for you." The wind around me began to swirl, forming a whirlwind of leaves and dust. Everything inside me told me I needed to resist, but the train, it had a power I couldn't explain. My feet took a step forward, then another. Before I could cross the door, I heard another sound, something that cut through the hypnotic pull of the train. A scream, coming from the darkness of the station. It was human, desperate, and at the same time, full of rage. I turned my head back and saw a figure running toward me. It was the same man I had seen in the mist earlier, the railway worker. "Don't get in," he shouted, his voice echoing through the station. "If you get in, you'll never leave." Those seconds were the longest of my life. On one side, the train called me, its irresistible promise of answers and an end to my curiosity. On the other, that man, with his eyes full of urgency, pleaded for me to choose life. The train's door began to slowly close, as if forcing me to decide. With my heart pounding, I finally made my choice. The door of the train closed slowly in front of me, and for a moment, the world around me seemed to stop. The sound of the wheels on the tracks faded, and the silence was so dense it seemed to swallow any thought, any movement. I stood there, frozen, looking at the man still running toward me, his hurried footsteps echoing through the station. "Don't get in," he yelled again. his voice now desperate, as if he knew what was at stake. "If you get in, you'll get lost. You'll never see the light of day again." I wanted to run to him. I wanted to leave, but my body was paralyzed, as if the train had cast an invisible curse over me. I looked at the inside of the carriage, and then, without being able to stop it, my feet began to move, as if some external force was guiding them. I was walking toward the train, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Before I could make another decision, a figure materialized in the train door, blocking my view. It was the same man from the newspaper, Michael Edwards, the missing journalist. His eyes were empty, as if there were no soul left in him. He smiled in a strange way, almost as if he recognized me. "You've come too far," he said, his voice now deep and emotionless. "Now you're one of us." I tried to scream, tried to fight against the force pulling me in, but there was no escape. The train, with its dark doors and suffocating interior, seemed to be swallowing me, and at the same time, I felt drawn to it, as if I had been destined to be there. The doors slammed shut behind me with a muffled thud, and I was inside, surrounded by shadows. The people, or what was left of them, were sitting around me. Their faces were unrecognizable, deformed, as if the passage of time had caused them to decay. But something in their eyes remained, an expression of despair, of someone who knew they would never see the light of day again. The carriage rocked gently, and the sound of the tracks beneath the wheels filled the space with a monotonous rhythm. The atmosphere was oppressive, almost as if the train itself were alive, absorbing every thought, every fragment of hope that emerged in my mind. I was losing my humanity. Each breath felt heavier, each movement slower. I looked at my hands, and I could swear they were starting to disappear, as if the flesh itself were disintegrating. The train, with its dark tracks, seemed to be sucking everything I was, and I no longer knew what was real and what was an illusion. Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed in the air, and I turned my head, recognizing the tone. It was the voice of the man from the station, the railway worker. "You're no longer in the world you know," he said, his words dragging like a cold breeze. "The train takes everyone who has something to pay, something to leave behind. And now you're one of us, part of those souls who will never see the light." It was at that moment that I realized the ghost train of Stoll wasn't just a legend. It was a curse, a thin line between the living and the dead, an entity that fed on curiosity, on the search for the truth. And now, I had been chosen to be part of this endless journey. The window of the train opened on its own, and I looked outside, seeing the distorted landscape, the thick fog covering everything, as if time and space no longer had meaning. The train was no longer on the tracks. It was floating, suspended between worlds. That's when the final revelation hit me with full force. The ghost train of Stoll wasn't a myth. It was a curse, a trap for those who sought answers and truth. It was the end of the line for those who dared to dig too deep. And now, I was another lost soul, wandering aimlessly, forever trapped in this cycle. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was Michael Edwards' empty smile, sitting among the others. He was no longer human. He was there, with the others, waiting for the next to get lost in the darkness. And then, the train continued, with no destination, no end.